At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Gus Chikala, President and CEO of Project Assistance. Gus founded Project Assistance in 1996 with the goal of transforming our clients' approach to portfolio and project management to achieve a standard of excellence in execution that consistently delivers expected project outcomes. A recognized portfolio and project management expert, Gus is a published author of many popular articles and books on the subject of project management, and he's frequently asked to present and teach topics of interest around project and portfolio management. Gus?
Thanks, Daniel. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start today's presentation by just giving a brief overview of today's agenda. As the title of the webinar suggests, we're going to talk about this concept of burning the ships. We'll then talk about how change occurs in organizations through projects. We'll talk then about how we can change the way we approach our projects, the methodology for doing that, some next steps, and as Daniel suggested, we'll also have some question and answers at the end. So the quote, the concept of burning the ships comes from this quote, Hernan Cortez, if we're going home in their ships. And the history of that, just to give some history, and I feel like I should apologize for using this title of burning the ships or referring to the conquering of North America, but the concept, in terms of from a leadership standpoint, has some validity. In the early 1500s, Spain was ruled by Charles V, and Cortez was on somewhat of a rogue mission. The governor of Cuba had revoked his charter for the expedition, and Cortez went anyway. And in terms of motivation for this specific project, if you will, Cortez was motivated to conquer the Aztecs in Veracruz because of their gold. And the Aztecs were famous for their gold and had adorned the Spanish soldiers with gold gifts whenever they came, which turns out to be a mistake because Cortez got a hold of that information. And this idea of scuttling the ships, they weren't actually burned, but they were scuttled and actually used for firewood later. But he was partially motivated to ask the troops to agree to get rid of the ships because some were loyal to the Cuban governor, and there was concern about mutiny. So Cortez really wanted to take this attitude that, we're going forward and we're not going back. And we're not going back to the ships, we're not going back to Cuba, we have to go forward and achieve the mission. So he did convince his supporting team to get rid of the ships, to actually sank them, and it's a mistranslation, but the concept we're talking about today is this idea of creating commitment in an organization. Having the idea that we can't go back to the old ways, and you'll see as we get into some of the meat of today's presentation that when we talk about change management, there are many organizations that essentially go back to the ships, that abandon the mission and don't move forward. So we want to talk about that concept today. And in order to really introduce this concept of what Cortez was talking about when his project was really getting commitment from the organization, the thing we want to talk about is how projects are these vessels of change. The change in organizations happens through projects, and a goal without a plan is just a wish is the quote that to introduce this topic. And to put things in context, what I want to suggest we talk about first is, why do projects happen? This thing at the bottom of the pyramid, this execution, this project management that we're involved in, that says that we're going to deliver something, really starts at the very top of the pyramid with this thing called mission, or why does the organization exist? What is the mission of the organization, and the values that the organization uses in order to achieve that mission. So what's important to the organization? Why does the organization exist? And then from those two things of why we exist and what's important to us, we can derive, hopefully from a strong leader, what we want to be as an organization. And as happens in a lot of organizations, when we think about what we want to be, it's not what we are now. So there's this question about if we are where we are and we're not where we want to be, how do we get there? And so I like simple definitions, and I heard a simple definition of strategy a long time ago. And I love three-word simple definitions. And the three-word simple definition I heard of strategy a long time ago was a plan for change. And when I first heard that, I had to sort of pause and think about it and see if I agreed with it or not. And the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about what strategies are, they are the ideas or the initiatives, if you will, or the plans that take us to where we want to be, the vision, right? So if we have a plan for change, at some point we have to say, well, how do we execute on the plan? So now we see this idea of strategy turning into execution, and oftentimes there's a disconnect there. And when we get a few more slides into this, I want to talk about the disconnect. But just in terms of setting the landscape for today, there's this idea that we execute on a project because it connects somewhere at the top of the organization to why we exist, what's important to us, what we want to be, and what we have to change in order to get there. So this idea of project delivery is really what we want to back into here. And so when we think about vision, we think about this idea that when we build a strategy to achieve the vision, at the portfolio management level, there's really two requirements for accomplishing the mission of the organization. Once the plan is there, once the vision is there for what we want to be or what we want to turn into, we have really two pieces in the pyramid. I'm now zooming in on the bottom two layers, which are the strategy and the execution. And there's two requirements for achieving the mission. We have to get the right projects going. So if we're going to change, typically what happens is we have, in a large organization certainly, almost unlimited ideas about how to get to some future state. But what we do have is limited dollars, limited people, resources, and limited time. And so the question is, what is that optimal mix? What are the right projects? How do we propose, select, measure, and respond, as we see here on the left side of the words under the words portfolio management? Propose, select, measure, and respond. How do we pick the right projects, and how do we stay with the right projects to carry the mission of the organization? And then when we think about actually delivering on those projects, we have this concept of doing the right projects. Okay, or doing the projects right. So we have right projects done right. So from a strategy standpoint, what are we talking about? Well, let's talk about some examples. So if we had a plan for change, a typical organization, in looking at its mission, its values, and its vision, and in deciding on a strategy that says, what do we want to be, what do we have to change, typically we'll think about things like entering new markets. So we're going to expand our geographic outreach as an example of a strategy. How about acquiring new customers, maybe even in existing markets? Okay. How about new products? How about cutting costs, increasing sales, improving customer satisfaction? So if we look at a shareholders report from a publicly held company, and there's a statement out there from the CEO saying what we want to be over these next 3 to 5 years, we'll typically see statements like this, right? Our strategy is to have a bigger outreach, more products, more customers, less costs, increased sales, and ultimately to produce the cash, which is oxygen for the organization and the shareholders. So now we think about, well, how do we get there, right? And I like to use this metaphor of thinking about projects are this vessel, right? So the lighthouse or the guidance is this mission, vision, value thing out on the horizon, and the way we get there is through this vessel we call projects, right? So the stimulus for change in an organization, the actual action that the organization takes often is through projects. In a strategy, we might say things like we just saw. We're going to acquire new customers. We're going to build new products. But at some point, we have to say, well, what are those new products? What are those new customers going to be? What is that geography going to be when we think about it? So as we begin to hone in on those ideas, we get these things called initiatives, and those things turn into projects. Okay, so within effective projects, oftentimes what's happened is we're not making the changes that are necessary to carry us out to that vision on the horizon. When projects go poorly, the vessels don't get to the lighthouse. And when that doesn't happen, we've got a problem. So we have this concept of how how projects are actually the catalyst for change. We did a webinar a couple of years ago. I think it's probably 4 years at this point, called Evolve or Die. And we had some similar concepts in there where we aligned the concept of evolution to how biological species change. They respond to their environment. They respond to the stimuli in their environment. And when those mutations, what we call mutations in evolutionary science, occur, that when that brown bunny rabbit has a mutation and creates white fur in the wintertime, there's more of them left over in the spring. And that's an advantage. So we have this same kind of idea. How do we change as an organization? How do we modify to fit into our environment so that we're the survivors in the future? Okay, so this idea about changing via projects is how do we deal with this tactical disconnect that happens with projects? You know, one of the things that happens, and some of you may be in organizations now or potentially in the past, is if the vision and the strategy and the mission and the values aren't clear, it does make it pretty hard to say, well, which projects make the most sense? How do we know we're working on the right stuff? So some of the disconnect can come from a clear strategy and a bad set of projects to support that, or a bad set of projects, a good set of projects to support a bad strategy, right? So we really need to think about how we close that gap there. So this idea of the project's not going well, we see this map of this meandering ship trying to get to the horizon, and one of the things we think about when we look at doing the right projects is not only did we propose and select a project to implement a strategy, to get us to the goals, to get us out to the horizon, to get us to that mission, that lighthouse on the horizon, but what are we doing as checkpoints as the project unfolds? You know, if we drew a course line from point A to point B, are we meandering like the red line all over the map here, or are we actually getting to our destination? So one of the disconnects is between the projects and the portfolio. The managers of the portfolio may or may not be taking the pulse of active projects. If we're not looking at this objective definition, a specific objective definition for a successful project, such as time, cost, quality, scope, are we meeting the spec? Are we delivering on time? Are we within budget? Oftentimes, and I ask this question to I like having a mixed audience in a live audience that has a mixed set of companies out there talking about this concept, and asking the question, as I did in the conference we did 2 months ago for business analysts, how many people work in an organization that have a formal cancellation process for projects that are meandering like the map that we see here? And I can tell you, I've been asking this for a lot of years, and I haven't seen too many hands go up in the room. Right? What is that intervention going to look like? If we're trying to change and the projects aren't going in the right direction, what are we going to do about it? So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about how if we have that green line, what we might call a baseline in project management, that plan, how do we get better at getting on that straight line? And if we're not on the straight line as an organization, what does the organization have to do? Not the project managers, but the organization. Okay, so this idea for today is how do we change the way we change? Right? If projects are the way we change and they're not going well, then we've got to change something about the way we change. So the vessel for change, the question is, how are your projects run? How do they need to be changed? How do they need to be optimized? So if the measure for success is a triple constraint model, cost, scope, schedule, or scope, schedule, resource is often how it's said. If projects are not regularly being delivered on time and on budget and on spec, what are we going to do about it? Right? And there's this whole concept of, well, we need to change the way we change. How do we get organizations to do this? This is what we do for a living. What do we face? And what do you face as either managers of project managers or even project managers that live in an environment like this where the projects aren't getting us there, or we've got projects in the mix that are the wrong projects. They're not the right projects, they're the wrong projects. So one of the things we think about is to say, well, wait a second then. So what you're telling me then is if my projects are the vessel of change and they're not getting to the horizon, then we're not changing. The organization's not evolving. It's not being responsive. It's not increasing those sales like it should have. It's not acquiring the new customers. The systems we're putting in place to expand our geographies aren't working, or they're being delivered too late, or they're not relevant anymore. There's competitors putting something out there before us. So if the changes we're making are not effective, and we go back to the mission and vision of the organization, the question we might ask is, what initiative do we need now? What's that next initiative? And what we might think about is saying, well, as we think about those initiatives, maybe we need one to improve our projects. And so we walk into organizations all the time, and I'd be very surprised if many of you don't share the same experience. This has been done before. Right? Organizations have tried to improve their approach to projects, and it hasn't gone well. So the real question is, how do you drive the change? How do we get this burn the ships commitment to moving forward so that when we have this initiative to improve our projects, we have the understanding that this is about creating change for the organization. This is not optional. Now, one of the things we've seen in this rough economy we've been having for almost 5 years now is that some of the things that were optional about being successful on projects are becoming less optional. Organizations are becoming less tolerant of funding projects that don't go well, or refunding projects, meaning we're putting more money into them even though we didn't deliver them this year. We'll go ahead and give additional budget for next year. So again, in context, what we have here is the portfolio management at the top. So if we have this idea of the right projects, and we have this thing called project management, the business controls to deliver on time, on budget, the other concept we need to think about is, what about the on-spec piece of this? Right, so we may have a good project management process that says how we scope it, how we plan it, how we measure actuals against baseline, both from a dollars and schedule standpoint, or maybe even labor. But what about what we're really trying to deliver? What are we doing about that? So we have this additional concern here, which is, do I have a methodology, do I have life cycle management, as you see down the left-hand side here, that enables me to deliver on spec? So if my project management methodology is responsible for on time, on budget, on spec, we essentially have two sets of methodologies. We have that sort of what I call the horizontal methodology that cuts across all the kinds of projects I deliver, the business controls, the project management, and then we have these vertical delivery points where we say, how do we deliver change in the organization by having an effective way of moving through a process of design, build, test, and deliver. Whether it's drugs, whether it's building buildings, whether it's software, whether it's consumer products, whether it's complex things like aerospace and defense, we have methodologies to deliver these things. So how do we change it? And as I referenced earlier, this concept of evolving. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the ones that are most responsive to change. So having that sense from the leadership team of what direction do we need to go, so when we send those vessels out there, is an assumption that we're working on. Right? We, as the people in the project management community, are receiving direction from the mission, vision, values, and strategy. Now the question is, how do we deliver? Okay, so another methodology, another life cycle methodology is to say, well, what's the methodology to change the way we change? The VIA methodology, which I'll talk about briefly here, vision, implement, and adopt. So how do we get that vision in place? It says, what's our current state, what's our future state, not for the organization, but for projects. So we're talking about a methodology now that says, how do we change the way we change? How do we change the way we deliver change in the organization? If we're not being effective now, if the vessels aren't getting us there, how are we going to get there? How do we drive change for the organization? Current state, future state, there's a gap, there's a vision, there's a roadmap. If you've been in any of our previous webinars, you've probably seen this covered before. If you like a lot of detail on column 1, let us know. We can send you to the link, or you can go to the website yourself and look up some of our past webinars. I'm not going to go deep on this one today. I'll talk about it briefly. Implement, we'll spend a few words on that, and then adoption is really what we're about here. How do we adapt to the environment around us? How do we get the organization to embrace the changes, or to accept the changes at least, that are necessary to get us to the vision for the organization? So we burn the ships and we go forward and we can't go back. And I'll talk about going back in just a few minutes here. So from a vision standpoint, if I look at an organization, you see on the x-axis this thing called rigor, and on the y-axis this thing called adoption. PMI has something they call the Project Management Maturity Model. We've taken maturity and broken it out into a little bit, to be a little bit more granular. We don't find that organizations can live at a nice clean 1 through 5 maturity level. We find that organizations can have a high level of rigor, meaning how deep they go into the methodology of getting it right. They can have a deep level of rigor, a light level of adoption. They can have a light level of adoption and a deep level of rigor. I meant to say a light level of rigor and a deep level of adoption, right? So and that's usually where we recommend going, right? From a transformation standpoint, from our current state to our future state, and going from where we are here to where we are there, what we're trying to do as an organization, if we're trying to change, is to get into high adoption, high rigor. How do we drive people to manage risk better in a rigorous fashion? And how do we make that to be a standard across the organization, not just the ones that have good project managers or high investment or high invisibility from the steering committee, but how do we get this to be a way of life across the board? Okay, so that's really what the vision methodology is about, is to think about in that first phase of our VIA methodology, the vision piece, is to look at what our current state is and where we'd like our current state to be, our future state to be, and what do we got to do to close the gap. By the way, you might notice that resource management only moved a little bit here. Okay, we increased the rigor. Hopefully the adoption moved up some. But the point is we don't move everything forward at once. We pick that starting point that says what's a meaningful landing point for the future, how do we drive the organization to get there? If we move on and think about implement, I always think of this as the easy part. You know, a lot of different analogies. It's pretty easy to buy the treadmill, right? That's the easy part. The question is, you know, what do I got to do not to turn it into a laundry hanger, right? And so the analogy here is I have a lot of different analogies I could use. It could be buying a guitar and leaving it to collect dust. It could be buying a gourmet oven because you want to be a chef. And in our world, a lot of this looks like buying PlanView, Microsoft Project Server, Primavera, you know, buying a piece of technology that's going to make me a better project manager. And yes, that can happen. Or yes, we can produce process and put it in a binder or put it out in a nice SharePoint collaborative intranet to give people access to the process. But the question is, how are we going to really get this thing to get used and not look like what we see in the picture here? Okay, so again, implementation, yeah, we can deliver that oven. You call us up and you want to do a project server implementation. We have the expertise for that. We partner with Microsoft. You know, we've been doing this for a lot of years. But we stand a lot of these things up to look like clothes hangers in 6 months. So what I really want to talk about, and really the gist of today's conversation, is really about the solution. Okay, so we're 27 minutes in here, and let's talk about the solution. This thing about adoption is the key. Right? Changing the way we change, driving change is what it's all about. So a government ill-executed, whatever may be its theory, must in practice be a bad government. And I think that I use a lot of different analogies here. I talk about bad kids with bad parents. Right? When I see project management, when we see project management in an organization not going well, my first reaction isn't to blame the project managers. You know, because what will happen is if we walk in and we give the project managers great technology and great process and great training, a lot of skills, a lot of experience, whatever that is, the organization oftentimes will be a barrier to those project managers being successful. So the question is, how do we create a system? How do we create an executive, legislative, and judicial system that really drives the governing of an organization in terms of how it runs its projects? And the interesting thing about this is, you know, processes, the way a lot of organizations think about processes when they're trying to change the way they manage their projects is they think about publishing processes for defining scope, for building a plan, for baselining a plan, for collecting actuals, for reporting against key performance indicators. All good stuff for all project management, right? The process we want to talk about now is, what about this process for driving change? It's a process, right? And if the organization doesn't have a process to drive change, it's using an ad hoc approach, right? So we see a lot of that. We'll talk about that as we go through this. And the first thing I want to think about is one of the things that's resistant to change is the current state, right? In a lot of in organizations in life, people get into a current state and they have a tendency to adapt to the current state. I call this survival mode. Okay, we find a way to live paycheck to paycheck. We find a way to work in places where we don't want to work. We find a way to be in relationships we don't want to be in. We find a way to deliver projects in a suboptimal fashion with a methodology that we know isn't right. but we get used to it. And what we get used to sometimes is harder to change than getting to a better spot. So this graph here is really to highlight the point that to get to that, as we look on the y-axis there, it talks about productivity and value. As we drive up the value or the productivity of the projects, that delivery of change which provides the value to the organization, how do we get there? And what we live through as we support our projects is we kind of show up and introduce this value of despair, this transition from the current state to a future state. So to get out of survival mode, to get out of our current state, we kind of go from being reactors to being proactors, right? We drive the change from the people that are at the end of the process, that are suffering the most by doing things late in the project, and we drive that to the front of the project. Well, who resists it? Well, the people at the front sometimes do, right? Who else resists it? Well, every organization has people who are engaged. They show up, they collect a paycheck, they do enough work to not get fired. But when we start introducing change in the organization, they're at risk of exposure. If we change the way we manage projects and I'm hiding off somewhere in the organization, not being noticed, and giving minimal effort, I'm going to resist this thing. So the survivors resist change. The people who have fiefdoms that are threatened because the organization maybe isn't structured properly will resist change. And the little arrow you see down there that says burn the ships is this point that we see when we're below the productivity that we used to have, and we maybe even feel like we have negative value. It's taken us more time to do projects than it used to. It feels like less projects are succeeding. People are confused. The methodology is not clear. Maybe management's starting to get a little bit of cold feet because there's risk involved in this thing, and there is. We've invested money. We've put technology out there. We've sent people through training. We've got the oven installed, and we're now burning the cookies. Right? That's a pretty uncomfortable place to be. And the unfortunate reality is, and many of you have seen this, and we certainly see this a lot in our line of business, is when we get to that real top downside of the valley of despair, people give up. They go back to the ships. Right? So they say, matter of fact, one of the symptoms of this we see is we'll get a call saying, we've got PlanView, but it's not working. Take it out and put it in Microsoft Project Server. And that's a red flag for us, right? I enjoy the game of golf, and I kiddingly talk about it. When I have a bad score, it must be the clubs, right? Can't be the golfer. Must be the ball, must be the teacher, must be the clubs, must be the wrong video I've been watching, right? But at the end of the day, we've got to look ourselves in the mirror and say, if we want to change, we're the ones that have to change. And so the next slide here I want to talk about as we get to the future state is just an example. A client we were working with trying to change the way they manage projects by introducing better rigor at the front end of the methodology. And what this graph shows for anybody that's been involved in designing and building systems, designing and building products, designing and building houses. I mean, most projects are designing and building something. If we discover change is necessary late in the process, the cost becomes exponentially higher. If it costs me $1 to change something in the definition stage, it'll cost me $10 to change it in requirements, $100 to change it in conceptual design, $1,000 to change it in detail, 10,000, 100,000, $1 million, prohibitive. So here's what happens. We discover problems in testing, and we learn in a survival mode, we learn how to reopen the patient, fix the project, spend all that additional money, all the heartache, upset the customer, deliver late or deliver with low quality as we make those changes. And that's what survival mode looks like. Now we introduce change. Hey, let's have a better requirements process. Let's have a better design process. What are we doing? Well, now all of a sudden, instead of QA having the problem, now the people in design have the problem. And oh, by the way, when we put that new methodology out there, sometimes maybe they need 4 weeks to do design, but we give them 2. So we're experimenting a little bit. We haven't done this before. So that valley of despair is real. As we drive the problems from the back end of the project delivery process to the front end of the project delivery process, there's a whole new set of players. There's a whole new set of tasks. There's a new methodology. There's an awful lot of reasons why people want to resist converting from reaction to proaction. So at the end of the day, the question is how do you drive it, right? How do we execute a governance process that drives change management, right? And the suggestion, as I alluded to a slide or two ago, is this idea that changing project management, yeah, it has something to do with putting in definition processes for scope and how we're going to build our plans and how we're going to collect our actuals and look at our key performance indicators and do scope management and communicate to our stakeholders. And that is, yeah, it's a set of processes, but what do we do to govern those processes? And it's like any other process. It has inputs and outputs and has transforming steps. Right? It has a frequency. It has RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Okay? It has attributes. For different projects, different sizes, different durations, or number of locations or resources, we may or may not have a different governance process for how we're going to drive change. So the governance process that we see working is really primarily 4 stages. There's this initial audit, review, or support. I like to think of it as support. That's why it's in capital letters. How do we support the project managers to embrace the changes we're asking them to be involved in? How does the organization become flexible about change? If we get a process wrong, are we willing to admit that and change it? Okay, so by looking into projects and having audit processes and having regular reviews and making that a process that's documented, that says there will be a review of the plan before the, project request goes in from the business, or before we commit to a number back to the business or to the customer. Or that once we're 30 days in, we want to see a checkpoint. Or once we're 90 days in, we want to go back and look at, are there status reports? Has scope management been followed? Are there actuals against baseline? Are the tasks in the project up to date? Am I sitting here on June 27th looking at projects or tasks that were scheduled to finish on June 10th, and they're still scheduled to finish on June 10th? That's a red flag. Right, so how do we design this process to go in and look at these projects and see what they're doing and see if they're on task? If they're not, how do we evaluate what's going on? And it says here links to the tactical plan, and that is the output from the first column of the VIA methodology, this idea that there's a tactical plan that sets up the organization for change. What did the tactical plan say about how we're going to evaluate projects? Reporting and escalation. So how are we going to report on these things? And what I'm talking about here is not just a dashboard, but a process that says, depending on the health and specific indicators and specific levels of tolerance or variance, if you will, from a norm, we're going to have specific actions. The sicker you are, the more attention you're going to get. It's a triage. And for a project manager, it's not welcome attention, but it's attention that the organization has a fiduciary responsibility to do to get to the mission. Right? What are we doing to really manage a portfolio? We've invested our money. Are we getting the results? And then follow up based on project health and process adoption and continuous improvement. So let's talk about a couple of examples. Implementing governance. I've seen where there's report cards. There's a lot of talk about red, green, yellow out there, but my question is, what are we really looking at? I've seen some great ones that talk about, shades of trouble a project gets in. We've got some issues, but they're under control. They're not high severity. We're on time, on budget, on spec, but we've got some known issues. Hey, the good news is we've got a plan in place. Things are starting to go wrong, or maybe it says there's known risks, but they're not issues yet. It doesn't have to be this exact scoring system. We start getting a little bit more trouble in the yellow zone. It's not on time, on budget, but there's a plan to get back on track. Okay, that's good. We know we're in trouble. We're in control. The objective definition of project control doesn't say you're on time, on budget. It says you know that you aren't, or that you know that you are. That's the definition of control. So we're in control. And oh, by the way, we now have a plan to get back on track. How about we get into the red zone? Not on time, not on budget, no plan to get back on track. And I would even add another one in there for project is failing. One of the points of failure could be we don't even know. We don't have a baseline. We're not sure what the spec is. We never had an initial budget. All we know is that we're spending uncontrollably and there's no end in sight. So the project is failing, cancel it now. Okay, so this is the kind of thing we would expect to see in the output of an audit process, some kind of a scoring system. And oh, by the way, maybe some actions. Okay, so if I'm in the A zone, maybe my project remains on a regular governance reporting cycle. If there's a monthly cycle I have to report to a governance steering committee, I continue to report if I'm in the A zone. On time, on budget, no known issues. We get into the known issues things, remains on a regular cycle, but critical issues are reported to the owning executive. We escalate those things up. How about we get into even more trouble? May need to increase the frequency of reporting. So this is often what we do with triage. We've probably all been on projects where we have daily reporting to an executive. It's a pain in the neck. We hate those projects, but that's what a solid organization will do that's managing its money well, is to say, look, if I give you money to spend, I'm going to make sure you're spending it the right way. And if you're not, I'm going to intervene. Okay? The D part is where we start saying, well, we might start pulling a project manager off of it. We might go to higher levels in the executive steering committee reporting cycles. We may go from a departmental level steering committee to an executive steering committee. And ultimately, I mentioned before this question about, I've asked organizations, how many people in this room have a formal project cancellation process? This is really the point where we're doing project and portfolio management, specifically portfolio management well. I mean, at the end of the day, when we talk about governance, we're really talking about managing a portfolio. We're beyond the project managers. So how do we, from a portfolio and governance standpoint, drive the changes to the execution of the projects by being that oversight governing body? So how do you define that? Well, what are the roles of these bodies? How do they interact? What are the rules? Again, we're talking about processes here, right? How does escalation occur when a project's in trouble? Who has the authority to cancel one? What happens if a project needs more time and resources? Maybe we will give it more money. One of the things project managers are often not asked to do is to manage beyond on time, on budget, on spec. What if I hit the spec, but it was a bad idea? Okay, we talked about when we were building this webinar, Honda's mission to build the best engines in the world. But what if we lose our way and we start creating gold-plated cup holders? Or a story I heard one time about somebody presenting to the executives at Southwest Airlines a few years ago that we should start serving meals because everybody else is doing it. Hold on a second, folks. We've lost our way a little bit here. If we're trying to be the low-cost provider, we can't afford to put meals in there. That costs money. Okay? What if the project manager needs to be replaced with counsel? What if the original parameters used to approve and fund the project have changed? And that's this stuff beyond on time, on budget. Right? The market conditions have changed. The return on investment's not there. The degree of difficulty has gone up. The alignment with the business goals changed maybe because the business goals have changed. Okay? As we start to build these products, are they really going to meet the mission of the organization? So this is really what governance and adoption is about. And now there's this idea of, what about the organization? What's its role in making it stick? Right? So we think about, organizational performance plans, compensation plans, benefit, safety, all just sort of these governing principles in an organization have a bearing on how they support more effective project management to help drive the change or become part of the problem. Right, so we think about linking project outcomes to performance plans, linking process adoption to performance plans. Right, compensation systems, linkage of pay increases and bonuses to the goals of the project outcomes and process adoption. So it starts to run pretty deep when we start looking at how far the organization could go. And again, back to this initial concept from the VIA methodology. What's the current state? What's the future state? What are we going to change? We're not suggesting all these things happen at once. Right? When we look at the rigor and the adoption of processes that need to be implemented, we're talking about some pretty rigorous stuff by the time we get to slide 33 here. Okay? So it has to be put into a plan. So in conclusion, we talked about projects bridging us from a strategy to an execution of change. Right? The projects are that vessel that bring us out to that light ship, that lighthouse on the horizon. And when the projects aren't delivering the expected results, the effective change isn't happening. Right? So we've got a problem. And this is where oftentimes we get involved. There's an initiative that's been identified to change the project management approach, to change the way we change. And oftentimes, the answer is let's buy technology. Let's buy the easy bake oven, and we'll have some easy projects going here. And we caution, about relying too heavily on technology. Certainly, technology can be an enabler, but it really has to be joined up with some of these other adoption challenges we're talking about. And finally, this adoption of a new approach, the burning the ships, the toughest and the most essential part, right? The adoption phase is the most ignored phase in the customers we deal with. And I'm not talking about small companies. I'm talking about big companies that either think they can do it on their own or think by putting a memo out that says or else in a bad economy that maybe people will be scared for their jobs and they'll just go ahead and change. I mean, we see a lot of different approaches to this, but the only one I've ever seen work effectively is the one where the adoption processes, in fact, are formal processes. Okay, so what to do? Well, it makes future problems now problems, right? We shift out of survival mode, we shift into future state mode, and we drive those problems from the back end to the front end. And even though we have problems now, they're exponentially cheaper. So what's the problem? Well, here's the problem. Human nature says we do one of two things: seek pleasure, avoid pain. Okay? What we just talked about was seeking pain early, right? And that's not natural. So that's the other thing we're dealing with, is we are flying in the face of human nature that says I should conserve energy. We evolved that way. We eat a meal, we should try to keep it in us as long as we can. We don't know when we're going to get another meal. Okay, that's the way we evolved. So we conserve energy. So why would I do something now that can happen later, after I have my next meal? Okay, so we're fighting a pretty serious problem here, and it's really ingrained in our DNA. We're programmed to conserve. Therefore, why would we introduce problems early? Expectation management really says that if I see a problem coming, I talk about it sooner than later. I be proactive. I deliver the bad news. I invite the criticism and the pain earlier in the process. If there's going to be a problem, let's find out now. Let's cancel the project if it's not a good project. So we really need a lot of commitment from an organization to be able to do that. So what I want to do is I want to spend just a minute or two transitioning into next steps here to get the Q&A going. We've been going for 47 minutes, so we got about 3 minutes here to get to the Q&A part. Just a little bit about us, as you might have figured out, that as you look at the bottom, the little band across the bottom really kind of says who we are. The blue band says delivering better, faster, cost-effective project-based results. That's what we do for a living. It's our job to bring people out to the lighthouse, right, to help them deliver the change in project-based results. So what does that mean? Well, we talked about risk, right? So the methodology, the VIA methodology, actually reduces risk because it drives change. It takes us out of that mode of can we afford to do this high visibility initiative that says we're going to get better at project management and have the risk of failure. Not a good thing. Maximizing ROI by chunking this up into a current state, future state, and transforming steps. We can see those incremental value propositions coming at us if we use the right methodology. What I call creating a continued move towards investment. It takes a long time for an organization to change the way it delivers its results in a project-based organization. So the way we maximize the ROI is we do it in increments, right? There's a methodology for that. Speeds the realization of business value. So by doing it in chunks, we see the value early. And then also, at the end of the day, what we really today seeing was this idea of driving effective organizational change. Okay, so we do that around these practices. So we have the vision and strategy, which is today's concept. Yes, we do the implementation of Microsoft EPM and SharePoint. Education and competency development, oftentimes training around process and tools. Application development, oftentimes integrating these systems, financial systems, ERPs, project management systems. Staffing, yes, we staff projects. This practice came out of staffing some of our solutions and has now grown into staffing the management of actual execution of projects, being in that vessel with you to get out to the horizon. Okay, so if you want to look at some of this rigor and adoption, if you want us to have us come out and talk to you, we can do that. Slide 39 talks about that. I'll give you Jan's contact information. Jan is handles our marketing department. So there's the information there. That number will get you to me as well. If you have somebody who you think needs to see this, if you have a boss, if you have a colleague, if you have somebody that works for you that you think needs to see this, we'll have this event posted out there probably within 24 hours. Our previous webinars are out there already. They go back about 4 years at this point. So there's the link for that. And with that, we have 10 minutes to go. And I'm going to turn to Daniel and ask him if we have any questions on the console.
Okay. At this time, I'd like to invite you to use your webinar console to submit any questions to us you might have. Actually, we already have received a few questions, so I can start with this one. You spoke earlier that adoption can drag us through a valley of despair. How long does it take to get through that?
For an organization adopting change, how long does it take to get through the valley of despair? It's a good question. I would say if there's a good column 1 plan, if there is a vision plan out there, the ones we develop look like 3 to 6 months to start seeing that recognition of value. So the expectation management that we get into is typically one to say expect to see value in 3 to 6 months. So expect set the expectation within the organization that that this isn't optional, that we're going to have these processes in place to drive adoption, as we just talked about, some of these governance processes, and be ready to get through the other side. And, the challenge here is, and I didn't say this earlier, but this is a good question. The challenge here is that we know when we are in organizations and things get tough and we're trying to change something, we know that we've seen people go back to the ships before. Okay, so if we don't like the change, there's this attitude of, just like when the king dies, the king is dead, long live the king. Right? The process is dead, long live the process you just told me is dead, because it's going to stick around, because we can't change, and we tried before, we don't know how to do it, so it'll go away, and if we just wait it out, we'll survive it. And the whole point of today is to talk about how we really get that commitment, to drive that commitment to the organization, to make them understand there's no going back here. Any other questions?
Yes, we have another question. What percentage of organizations that you work with actually do an adoption phase?
Percentage. Well, let me see. Let me give you a relative answer to that first. In relative terms, organizations. Well, first of all, some organizations don't make it through the valley of despair. We do go in and implement project management technology that doesn't get used. Nobody's probably surprised by that. There's a high correlation between the organizations that don't do it. I'm not even talking about engaging us. It's not a sales pitch, right? Organizations that don't do the vision methodology or the adoption methodology phases, that think all you got to do is put the easy bake oven in, they're the ones that fail. Now, from a percentage standpoint, we see failure rates and by the way, let me define failure. Not getting through the adoption phase, or failing in the implementation phase, having the treadmill turn into a clothing hanger. Our definition of failure is that we didn't achieve the original objectives. We might have put some technology in, but if the original, I'll give you a real life example, a common example. The original idea was we were going to put project management technology in to know what our capacity versus demand is from a resource standpoint. Very, very common problem that people engage us to help them solve. So we get the technology in, and yeah, people put plans out there and you can see what the schedule is, but there's still not that validity that's supporting resource demand, which comes from the tasks and the plan to say what the labor is. Okay, if that data is not in there, they haven't adopted, right? They haven't adopted what they said they were going to adopt, and it's certainly more than half. So the fast answer from a percentage standpoint is less than half through the adoption phase. We've had more and more customers who are, in fact, committing to statements of work, to proposals, to work orders that say adoption, and now we're moving towards how many of them are actually going to embrace it once we stand this thing up. So, good question. A lot of failure out there still, but certainly getting better. And the organizations are less tolerant of failure, so there tends to be, in our world, we see more people embracing this. Any other questions?
I believe that's all the questions we have. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all. As I mentioned, the webinar will be posted on our website tomorrow. It'll be both the slides and the audio. And thank you all very much.